Okay, welcome to this week's Torah portion. And this week is called Vayishlach, and it means he sent. And it comes from that first sentence in this week's Torah portion where Jacob sends his messengers ahead of him to go and meet with Esau. This week's Torah portion is in Genesis 32, verse 3 to 36, verse 43. The Haftorah portion is Isaiah 11, verse 7 to 12, and Obadiah 1, verse 1 to 21. I just want to stop here. I actually went and read these this week. I had extra time when I did my studies, and I would like to encourage you to go and read Obadiah or Obadiah if you're done with this teaching, because there's only one chapter in Obadiah, and the entire chapter is a prophecy about Esau. And you're going to see when we go through the study today, we're going to contrast Esau and Jacob with each other. So it's quite interesting when you've got that background to go and read Obadiah. Otherwise, the book may seem a bit confusing. The Brit Hadashah is 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1 to 13, and Revelation 7, verse 1 to 12. So first I want to start off with Jacob's journey. So we see in the past two Torah portions, Jacob embarking on two journeys. In the first one, Jacob leaves the promised land. And this is something that we should never do, but God allowed this for Jacob because Jacob is the one that needed to go and be changed. We see God working on his character as he embarks on this journey. In this week's Torah portion, Jacob returns to the promised land, and that's what we should all be doing. In a physical sense, yes, we should all go up to Jerusalem and visit that beautiful city and country and spend our money and our tithes there because the word commands us to do that. We need to bless Israel because those who bless them will be blessed. But in a spiritual sense, we all need to return to the promised land because each one of us, and there's a spiritual promised land, and it's linked to the covenant. You cannot separate the promised land from the covenant. So as we return with the way that we serve God, with the way that we worship to the promised land, we're all embarking on the same journey that Jacob's embarking on when he returns. We see when Jacob leaves the promised land, he's running away from Esau. And this week he's running away from Laban. So it was so amusing for me to realize that we see so much of our own lives in the stories of the patriarchs. And you can run from one enemy, but you're just going to encounter that enemy in a different form or way elsewhere in your life until you actually have victory over it. So you cannot run from those things that you struggle with, that you wrestle with. Somewhere along the line, you're going to have to face it. So we see Jacob running away from conflict in his first journey and again running away from conflict in the second one. Jacob's like all of us. He didn't like conflict. A lot of people don't like conflict. The sages say that when Jacob embarks on his first journey, we see the sun set. Go and read, I think it's in Genesis 28. It says, as Jacob leaves, the sun sets. But this time we see when the sun rises, he gets blessed, his name gets changed. And this is also symbolic for us. The moment we turn our back on the promised land, the moment we turn our back on the covenant and we start walking into the world, it really is like the setting of the sun. And in spite of that, all of us, there where he was with Laban, that's where God blessed him with his wives, with his children. He got many livestock. He got really rich there in the world. But then there's a time when he needed to come back to the promised land. And when we start turning back, when we turn our faces back and we embark on this journey back to the promised land and the covenant, then the sun rises. And I was standing yesterday in my kitchen while I was preparing dinner, and I was just thinking how much my life has changed since I've really, with everything in me, turned back and embarked on this journey of returning to the promised land. So often we read in the Bible of all these promises and blessings, and it's like it's just out of our grasp. And I was just amazed if I look at my life now. Despite all the ups and downs and the trials and tribulations that don't go away, the blessings that I can see in my life, it's really like the sun is shining despite all of that. The sun has risen despite all of that because I've turned back, because with everything in me, I'm trying my best to return to this place of covenant with God. In the first journey, Jacob falls asleep, and that happens at night, and he has an encounter with God. That's where where he sees the ladder. In this journey, he also has an encounter at night. So he's not asleep that we know of. In this encounter, he's wrestling with God or with an angel. They're not sure because the name isn't given. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But he has an encounter at night. And with both of these encounters, there's a change that takes place. So in Genesis 28, with the first encounter, let's see if we can find the change. Then suddenly Adonai was standing there next to him, and he said, I am Adonai, the God of Abraham, your grandfather, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you are lying, I will give to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the grains of dust on the earth. You will expand to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. By you and your descendants, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Look, I am with you. I will guard you wherever you go, and I will bring you back into this land because I won't leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So how beautiful, even though Jacob is embarking on this journey away from the promised land, God says, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to stay with you. And you know what? I'm going to bring you back to this place. But if you know the covenant promise that God made to Abraham and to Isaac, you'll know that he promised them that their descendants will be like the stars in heaven. But to Jacob, he says, your descendants will be as numerous as the grains of dust on the earth. So that's the change. There's a change here to the promise of the covenant. And the sages look at this and they ask, why? And then, they ask, well, which would you rather be? Would you rather be a star or would you be a grain of dust? And I think that's easy. All of us would rather be a star. It's a bit more elevated than being a grain of dust. And they say that the reason that God changed this is that it's actually because Jacob left the promised land, because Jacob did not trust God to protect him from Esau. Remember, he's running away because Esau said, I'm going to kill you because you took my birthright and my blessing. I'm going to kill you. And instead of realizing God is not going to allow me to be killed by anyone, God is not going to allow Esau to do anything to me, because the prophecy that was given to my mother was that the older will serve the younger. God's made a covenant with me. I've got the blessing. I've got the birthright. Instead of making a stand for his inheritance that was part of the promise that God gave him, he doubted God and he ran away from Esau. And that's why God changed this promise. So instead of he lost a bit of the elevation of the promise. His descendants lost that because of him not having faith that God would protect him against an earthly enemy. And really, who is Esau if you compare him to God? And that brings us to our lives today. How many times have we been threatened by a person? And instead of reacting out of, it is written, this is the covenant I have with God. This is what he promises. What can a man do to me? Instead of reacting like that, often we react out of our flesh, just like Jacob. And we make our own little plans. And in the end, without us realizing, we may even be walking away from the covenant. But in this week, we see in Genesis 32, verse 26 to 30, when he saw that he did not defeat Jacob, he struck Jacob's hip socket so that his hip was dislocated while wrestling with him. The man said, let me go because it's daybreak. But Jacob replied, I won't let you go unless you bless me. The man asked, what is your name? And he answered, Jacob. Then the man said, from now on, you will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have shown your strength to both God and man and have prevailed. Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he answered, why are you asking about my name? And blessed him there. So a little bit later in the study, we're going to talk about names and the significance of names. I want you to remember this last verse about this angel or man or God that Jacob was fighting with that would not give his name. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But what I want to focus on now is what changed after this encounter. So after the first encounter, we see the sun setting and we see there's a change to the covenant. So we know that's a little bit negative, although God promises, I'm going to protect you and I'm going to bring you back. But then in this one, we see there's two profound things that change. And this is really a much I think, better change, because he's coming back to the covenant now. This is more of a blessing. God strikes him in his hip socket. So the way that he walks changes. The way that he does things change. Your hip is also significant of leaning on your own strength. And we see that was why he ran away from Esau, because he was leaning on his own strength. He was making his own plans instead of trusting God and the covenant. But now God says, I'm going to change the way you do things, Jacob. I'm going to change the way you respond to your enemies. I'm going to change the way you respond to circumstances. And that's why he strikes him in the hip. But not only that, I'm going to change your name, because your name has got to do with your character. And I'm bringing about a change in the character of Jacob. And that's why I'm changing your name. So we see a significant change when Jacob comes back in the way that he does things and in the way that God says, this is who you are. It's got to do with his identity and his character. So let's talk a little bit about Esau and Jacob. In Genesis 25, it says the boys grew and Esau became a skillful hunter and outdoorsman, while Jacob was a quiet man who stayed in the tents. Now, you can do your own little self-study on this, but basically what that means is that because Jacob was in the tents, he was studying Torah. He was busy studying the word of God. And Esau, he was a man of the field. He was a man of the world. So there's this contrast between the two. And what's interesting is that they say, well, if you read the Bible, you'll see that Jacob and Esau, this is the first twins that we find in the Bible. And God's plan for these twins were really that the two of them together would walk in the covenant and would produce the 12 tribes of Israel. They would be Israel. But that's not how things happened. Jacob was the one that chose to be obedient to the covenant, but Esau did not choose to stay obedient to the covenant. So he kind of rejected his birthright. And so even in the womb already, there was the struggle between the two of them. And Jacob was the one that realized that with the birthright comes the blessing, but with the birthright comes the responsibility as well. Esau just wanted the blessing. He didn't want the responsibility. And so this journey of Jacob started where he actually needed to take on some of the attributes and some of the identity of Esau so that he can stand in the gap for Esau and himself. He needed to play the role of Esau and Jacob in order to fulfill this promise of bringing forth Israel. But when you look at this and you realize that from the very beginning, even in the womb, Jacob was the one that was aligned with the covenant. He was the one that had the calling and the blessing to fulfill the covenant. You know, our worldly eyes, when we look at it, would think, well, God really needed to deal with Esau. He's the one that had the problem here. It's not Jacob. But who do we end up reading about for many chapters? In fact, the rest of Genesis is basically about Jacob and his descendants. We read quite a lot about Jacob and very little about Esau. We don't see any character development. We don't see God putting Esau through trials and tribulations. We don't see Esau getting tested. We just see God working on Jacob. And this made me think so much of my own life. You know, often when we have enemies or we have difficult people in our lives or people that pursue us or bring strife or conflict, you know, my first thought is, Lord, you need to sort this person out. Just look at their character, look at their fruit. There's something wrong with them, deal with them. And then at the end of that period, when I look back, I realized, wow, God actually dealt with me through this. He showed me the things in my life that's not aligned with his character. He showed me the things that I need to work on, the things that I need to change. And this is the story of each one of us. You've got a choice. If you're going to not align yourself with the covenant, you're going to be like Esau. God is just going to leave you because you've already made your choice. But if you're going to choose this path of walking in the covenant and walking in relationship with God, God is going to change you because he needs you to realign with the character of God. He needs you. Remember, we spoke so many times about that part in Genesis where it says God created us in the image and likeness of God. The image is there That's who we are. It's built into our very fiber. But the likeness speaks to character, and that's something that's developed throughout your lifetime. I don't think we're ever going to come in this lifetime to a place where we're going to say, okay, I've arrived now. I've made it. I am in the full likeness of God. I think it's something that's going to happen throughout your lifetime. So God's going to work on that character. So when you are like Jacob and you choose the covenant, just know that God's not going to deal with your Esau's because they've already made their choice. But when you choose covenant, God needs to deal with your character. And that's why we see the story continuing with Jacob. So Esau, it means red. We see another name for him is Edom. And if you listen nicely, you'll hear the word Adam come from that, which means earth. So Esau really represents the flesh, our fleshly desires, being self-centered. Again, he just wanted the blessing, but he didn't want the responsibility. And sadly, that sounds like a lot of believers today as well. We just claim all the blessings in the word, but we don't want to take the responsibility of walking in the covenant, of walking in obedience, of submitting my own desires and my own flesh and that which I want to what does God say I'm allowed to do and not allowed to do. And then he's not a servant, Esau, it's all about him. And people need to do things for him and give things to him. But Jacob is a servant. We see he serves Esau this food. So he was preparing the food, not just for himself, but for others as well. And we see him going into Laban's house and serving for the bride. So in that sense, he's also a picture of the Messiah because he's a servant. But Esau's not a servant. And Esau also represents the accuser. And I want you to, there's actually a study that Bill Cloud does on Jacob and Esau that's really good. And what he says is that we often we hear the story of Jacob and we see how, we'll look at the scriptural references now, but both Esau and Laban accuse Jacob of being a deceiver. And that's what we identify with the name Jacob, is deceiver, okay? But Bill Cloud does this beautiful study where he shows that even in the womb, Jacob was not grasping Esau's heel to try and supplant him, to pull him down so he can come out first. It actually says that Esau was trying to stomp Jacob down. He was trying to crush his head because he wanted everything for himself. And Jacob was merely pushing out his hand and keeping Esau from crushing his head. So why do we say Esau is the accuser? Because we see throughout their lives in the scriptural passages how Esau keeps on accusing Jacob of something that Jacob did not do. And Laban does this as well. Let's see in Genesis 27, it says Esau said his name Jacob, he supplants, really suits him because he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and here now he has taken away my blessing. Then he asked, haven't you saved the blessing for me? So we see here that Esau falsely accuses Jacob of something that Jacob did not do. Esau was well aware that the birthright goes with the blessing, that you could not separate the two. So that day when he sold his birthright, he made a choice. There was a transaction that took place. Esau knew by giving Jacob the birthright, he was giving away the firstborn blessing as well. But he conveniently forgot that. So he accuses Jacob of supplanting me these 2 times. How did Jacob did nothing wrong. Jacob did not seek out Esau and say, please sell me your birthright. Esau came to Jacob. And so it was a legal transaction that took place, but conveniently Esau now blames Jacob. It sounds a little bit narcissistic as well. It's all about me, myself, and I, and I'm always the victim. You did me wrong. So we see that there's this false accusation against Jacob, that he's a supplanter, that he's a deceiver. And this is what the enemy does to us as well. There's a lot of false tags and false names and tarnishing on your character throughout your lifetime where people come and accuse you of things that are not true. But it's your choice whether you accept that and agree with it or not. Because we're going to look at Jacob's name a little later, and Jacob's name is actually quite beautiful. It's not this thing about supplanting and deceiver that we kind of see in the Bible, him being accused of. So I want you to keep that in mind and do a bit of self-study and see what things in your own life have people accused you of that you've started agreeing with, where you started seeing yourself like that, because that's not your true identity. That is how the enemy works. That is how the accuser works. We see this with Jacob as well, with Laban. Laban means white, but if you spell Laban backwards in Hebrew, it actually means fool. And if you look at the story of Laban, you can really see him acting like a fool. And Laban is not honorable. And we can see this because he cheats Jacob out of a wife. He makes him work for one wife and then gives him another. He changes his wages. And it also made me think of being a whitewashed tomb, because so often I think maybe that's what Yeshua had in mind when he spoke of the whitewashed tombs as well as this Laban character, because he presents himself as being very godly and being very good and honorable, but really on the inside, he's rotten. He's not good. And we also see that he's, in last week's Torah portion, he uses divination, he's prone to idol worship. So there's something with Laban that's just not 100% right, just a bit off. And but he also comes and he accuses Jacob. So we see both of these people that Jacob ran away with, that he tries to avoid conflict with, both of them falsely accuse him. In Genesis 31, verse 26, Laban says to Jacob, "What do you mean by deceiving me and carrying off my daughters as if they were captives taken in war?" And Jacob was not the one that was deceiving. It was Laban. Laban was the one that lied about the wives. Laban was the one that changed his wages how many times. So Laban was actually the deceiver, not Jacob. But again, Jacob gets slandered and accused of being the deceiver. So you may ask, what about Jacob dressing up like Esau and getting the blessing? Well, that was not Jacob's plan. That was actually Rebekah's plan. So then we should say Rebekah is the deceiver. But also, like I said, because they were twins, there was this prophecy that these twins together would bring forth the 12 tribes of Israel. And because Jacob was committed to the covenant and Esau rejected the covenant, part of the prophecy being fulfilled was that Jacob had to take on part of Esau's identity in order to fulfill this prophecy. So this was actually prophecy being fulfilled as well. So let's look at what is in a name, because we see a lot of names in this Torah portion, and we see Jacob's name specifically being changed. So Jacob actually means in Hebrew, "May God be your defending rear guard." Isn't that beautiful? And if you think of that first journey that he departed on, where God appeared to him and said, "I'm going to make your descendants like the stars," it actually, there's a bit of this name in there where God says, "I'm going to protect you and I'm going to bring you back." It's also, if you continue reading in this week's Torah portion, after the incident with Dinah, where she was raped by Shechem, and then Levi and Simeon killed all the people of Shechem, all the men. It says there that Jacob was really scared that the surrounding tribes would attack him. But then God woke him up and said, "Go to Beit El and build an altar to me there." And he got up and he went. And it says that the fear of the Lord came on all the surrounding cities and no one attacked Jacob. So we can see that from the very beginning, when Rebekah gave him the name Jacob, this "May God be your defending rear guard," this has been a promise that's been fulfilled every time someone spoke his name, Jacob, Jacob, they were speaking, "May God be your defending rear guard." And so the supplanter, the deceiver, that's the false identity that he was accused of by his enemies. And each one of us have that, we have that choice to agree with, well, who does God say I am? What is my identity in Messiah? And who does the world and my enemies say I am? And it's really going to be up to you who you agree with. And whoever you agree with, that is going to be true about your life. But we also see that God gives him another name, and this name is Israel, and this means Prince of God. So if we look at the two names, we see Jacob and Israel, and there's a lot of application to this. We can say Jacob is the soul, and Israel is the spirit, and the soul needs to submit to the spirit, which is also true. It's a beautiful picture of the soul and the spirit, but God created us body, soul, and spirit, so you cannot separate the two. And God needed Jacob and Israel, the soul and the spirit, to be in unity and to function the way where the soul is submitted under the spirit in unity, moving forward in line with the covenant. And then we see he's walking out his full potential. May God be your defending rear guard, Prince of God. So names hold potential. And your name tells about your character, your reputation. So let's talk about this a little, your character and your reputation. You know, there's a lot of sayings that we have. So, my name was tarnished. My name was thrown away. My name has been slandered. It's not just got to do with your physical name, Jacob. It's got to do with your character, with your reputation. So when we hear a person's name, it tells us about that person, about their character, about their reputation. And I would like to suggest that maybe that's why the angel or God himself that was wrestling with Jacob, when Jacob asked him, what is your name? Maybe that's why he didn't give his name. Because how do you put God's character and reputation into one name? How do you fit that into one name? Where God is outside of time, he's in control of everything. He is the creator of everything. He is so big that our human minds cannot even conceptualize or begin to understand him. How do you put that into one name? And maybe that's why we also see all through the word of God, God revealing himself to people in his different names, because every time there's another name of God revealed, it's another aspect of his character. It's another aspect of his reputation being revealed. When Moses asked him, how am I going to tell the people who you are? And God said to him, I am who I am. For our minds, it's so difficult to conceptualize, but that was the best answer, because he is God. He is everything. He is in every situation. He is whatever you need in every situation. It is so big that you cannot limit it through language. And so I think that's why when God was wrestling with Jacob, he didn't give him a name. So each person has a choice to fulfill or avoid the potential of your name. So let's look at someone like Jacob. Jacob, that means, may God be your defending rear guard. Israel, that means Prince of God. He's got a choice. Am I going to agree with the potential that's built into my name? Am I going to act like someone that knows God is my defending rear guard? Am I going to act like a prince of God? Or am I going to reject the potential of my name? And am I going to avoid it and agree with what the enemy says about me? I'm a supplanter. I'm a deceiver. And so every person has that. And maybe this is something interesting you can go and do. Maybe you can go and look at, what does your name mean? I remember when I started looking at the Hebrew alphabet, I went and I looked at, what does Alzon, how do you spell it in Hebrew? And what does each letter mean? And you know, it was so amazing to realize my parents, when they gave me my name, they did not know anything about Hebrew. They were not even in the Hebrew roots. But so prophetically, God gave them this name for this little girl, and they called me Alzon. And Al is the name of God. It means God. And Zon means to fill up and to provide. And so every time someone speaks my name, they're saying over me, God fills up, God provides. And it's so amazing to see, if I look back at my life, yes, there have been difficult times, but to see how God has provided every time, in every need, up to the brim, in fullness. So I want to encourage you, go and look at what your name means. Go and look at, are you fulfilling the full potential of what you have been named? Because every time someone speaks your name over you, they're speaking that potential over you. But in my life, I've also had people accuse me of being different things. And I have the choice. Am I going to agree with the accuser? Am I going to align with that part that people say that's your character, that's your reputation? Or am I going to align with what God's Spirit told my parents to call me? And that is who I am, because that is who He says I am. And so I want to encourage you as well, not to just look at your name, but also see what the Word of God says. He calls you beloved. You are mine. And to also know that your identity is rooted on Him, no matter what happens or what people tell you about yourself. So let's look a little bit at names. So in Hebrew, the word name is the word Shem. And so I don't know if you've heard before, many times the Jewish people will speak of Hashem, and Hashem means the name. So they will not pronounce Yod He Vav He, the four-letter word of God. They will pronounce it as Hashem, the name, because they understand this thing of we cannot build or limit God's character and reputation into the pronunciation of one name. So they place his name above all other names and they call him Hashem. Okay. But Shem is name in Hebrew, and Shem is spelled with the letter Shin and a Mem. And when a Mem is at the end of a letter, it's called a Mem Sufit. So the Mem's shape changes a little. There are 5 letters in Hebrew where this happens, where when it's at the end of the word, it gets added, it's called a Sufit, Mem Sufit, and it changes the shape. So that's a Shin. And those of you that have mezuzahs on your doorposts, you'll see that's also the letter that's on the mezuzah. And then the Mem Sufit, it's closed when it's at the end. So let's look at these 2 Hebrew letters, because we want to look into what do these 2 letters represent, because that's going to give us more context and background for what is in a name. What does a name mean? So Shin means fire and Mem means water. And what a contrast, right? If you think of 2 contrasting things to put together, fire and water are definitely that, because fire puts out water, but if water puts out fire, but you can also burn water until there's nothing left, cook water until it's all evaporated and then there's no water left. So both of them cancels out the other. We also know that the heavens are called Shemaim, and Shemaim is a combination of fire and water. So there's some link to heaven as well. And I believe for me, when I look at names and we look at this fire and water and how it's connected to heaven, there's a little piece of your scroll, your character, your reputation that God predestines for you that gets released out of heaven when you are conceived and when your name is given. So there's a part of your character that comes from heaven. And fire and water both hold potential for life and death. And that's the same with our names. You can live up to the reputation or to the potential of your name, or you can avoid the potential of your name. Let's look at fire. Fire can definitely burn you. Fire can kill you. Fire can hurt you. But have you ever watched one of these survivor programs? The first thing they try and get when they're on an island is fire and water, because those are the 2 things you need to survive. You need fire to stay warm. You need fire to cook your food on. You can even use fire to sterilize certain things. So fire can bring life or death. The same with water. If you don't have water to drink, you're going to die. But too much water, think of a flood, think of a tsunami, think of drowning in water. It can also bring death. So just like with a name, where you've got the potential to be really everything that God's predestined for you to be, or to avoid your entire destiny, so a name can also bring forth life and death. Okay, so we actually spoke of that before. So I'm just going to quickly touch on that again. Jacob and Esau were the first twins. And it says actually that Esau had certain attributes and character traits, and Jacob had certain, and they were supposed to come together. And then these two together were supposed to bring forth the 12 tribes. But because Esau rejected the potential of the positive things in his name, in his destiny, Jacob had to take on that identity and that responsibility. Okay, so let's quickly talk about how God deals with Jacob's character, because we spoke about that. Instead of doing things the way that people think God should do it, which was, oh God, please deal with Esau. There's something very wrong with him. God leaves Esau. He leaves him to do whatever he wants because he's not aligned with the covenant. God leaves him, but God deals with Jacob's character. So Jacob was a man dwelling in tents. Now he's a shepherd dwelling in the field. So we see there wasn't balance with Jacob. And that's very important in our journey with God, to be balanced. Jacob was just dwelling in tents, but God needed him to also have a bit of that character of Esau, where he could go into the field, where he could be in the field. There had to be balance between the soul and the spirit. We're placed on this earth, which is a physical earth, in a physical body. We can't live up here in the spiritual realm all the time. There has to be balance between the spiritual realm and the physical realm. So we see Jacob going as a man dwelling in tents, running away from Esau. He ends up with Laban, and he basically ends up sleeping in the field tending sheep, which is the furthest away from a tent. So there God brings a bit of balance back into Jacob's life. And we also see that Jacob is not a man of violence. Esau was the hunter. But there are certain times in your life where you need to stand up and be a man of action and do something. And there are other times where you need to be quiet and know just to sit and let the Lord deal with this. And this is something else that God needed to fix in Jacob's character. So we see Jacob not being a man of violence, but in the end, when this man or angel of God comes, he wrestles with him. He doesn't get the best of Jacob. And so we see there's a bit of correction and balance coming there as well. Both journeys are related to conflict avoidance. And unfortunately, in our lives, we cannot avoid conflict all the time. But also, there was something about Esau that Jacob needed to face and overcome. There was an enemy that he needed to have victory over. And the same with Laban. But in that sense, Jacob was a bit of a coward. He ran away from both of them. And my mom always says, when there's something that you face in your life, whether it's fear, whether it is depression, or whether it is financial issues or whatever, you cannot avoid it. You cannot run away from your problems, because you're going to face that same problem wherever you run. She calls it, in this area, it's going to be a white dog. There is going to be a pink dog. There is going to be a blue dog, but you're going to face that dog wherever you go, until you've overcome it. And that's so true of our own struggles in our own life as well. If you've got a problem with addiction or with a certain type of sin, you can't run from it. You're just going to face it in a different form wherever you run into. The only way to face it is to make a stand and get victory over it. And also, you cannot run away from God, because most often that struggle that you have, you think you're struggling with Esau. What happened with Jacob? He thought that it was Esau struggling with him that night. It was Esau that was upon him, ready to kill him. But really, when the sun came up, it was God that he was struggling with. And that's the truth for us as well. You know, we think we're struggling with one thing, but really, when the sun rises, we realize we're struggling with God, because he's the one that says, you're allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do that. This is how I want you to live. This is what it looks like to be in my likeness. So whatever you're struggling with that does not conform to his rules, to his regulations, and to his likeness and his character, you're not really struggling with that thing. You're struggling with God himself. So the question is really, who or what is your real enemy? And the struggle for most of us is inside of us. Jacob thought the struggle was Esau, but if you look at the prayer that he was praying, when he's servants came back and they said, Esau is coming with 400 men. Where was the battle in Jacob's life? It was in his mind. He was imagining how Esau is going to kill all the children, kill all the women. And he actually prays and he says, Lord, I'm scared, help me. And where does fear come from? It comes from within. So those things that come into our lives, we so tend to put a physical face to it, and we get stuck on the person, just as Jacob got stuck on the person of Esau. But really, God allowed that to come into your life because there's something in your character that he needs to reveal, that he needs you to deal with. He needs to show you where your identity is not rooted on him and where you've aligned with the truth of the enemy. And so he uses this thing that you see as a physical person or a physical circumstance to actually work on your character. But the battle and the enemy is inside of you because it's in your head. It's in your head that you need to take victory over this enemy. And it's often God in disguise. Grant Luton says, the God we embrace in the light is the same God we are wrestling with in the dark. And if I know it's not easy for people to acknowledge this, but if you're honest with yourself, how often have difficult situations come where in your heart you've questioned, Lord, why? Why are you allowing this? And that is the wrestling that we have with God, is questioning why, instead of asking what needs to change in me. What do I need to submit to your will, to change to your likeness? Because the moment you submit, that's when a wrestling match ends, is when someone gives up, when you submit. And we just need to submit and surrender to God. And the moment we submit and surrender to him, what happens? He changes Jacob's name and he changes Jacob's destiny. And that's what happens with us as well. The moment we can acknowledge, okay, this is what's wrong. I submit, Lord. This is where I'm not aligning with your word, with your truth, with your covenant, with who you say you are, with who you say I am. The moment you submit and surrender to that, and you say, Lord, I'm going to start doing things the way you tell me to do it, that's the moment you can change your name, go into the full potential of the scroll that God's released for you, and change your destiny. Why did he touch his hip? It's his personal strengths. And what changed? He changed the way he walked and he changed his direction. And so often when we face our battles, we lean on our own personal strength. If you're good at planning, that's what you put your trust in. If you're good at working hard, that's what you put your trust in. If you're good at whatever, that's what we tend to put our trust in. But that's the part of our lives that God then touches, that he hurts, that he changes, because you're putting your trust in that, you're not putting your trust in him. And the moment he takes on that thing that you're good at and he hurts it and he weakens it, we can realize this is not where my strength lies. My strength and my hope should be in God, in who he says he is, in his covenant. And then that changes the way that we react to certain circumstances. It changes the way that we do things. It changes the way that we speak and that we think. And that changes our direction. So who are you? After the name change, God changes his name a second time. Jacob had a bit of a problem. We see God changing Abram and Sarah's name, for example, and never again are they called Abram or Sarai. They are called Abraham and Sarah after the name change, because they immediately adapted and adopted the identity change, the character change that God did when he changed their name. But Jacob struggles a little bit with this because the rest of Genesis, he's called Jacob 80 times and he's called Israel only 40 times. So we see this interchanging taking place where sometimes he's called Jacob and sometimes he's called Israel. Now, there are two schools of thought about this. One side says it's because every time he acts in a fleshly way, he is Jacob, he's acting as Jacob. And every time he acts in a godly or spiritual way, he's called Israel. Then there's another school, or the sages, other part of the sages that say that every time he's called Jacob, It's when he is acting in the attributes of Jacob that says, God is my rear guard. And every time he is called Israel, he is living up to the full potential of Prince of God. But even if you look at that, you know, the soul, the body acting fleshly, it does need God to be our rear guard, because usually when we act out of our flesh, we make mistakes and we need God to rescue us and help us. And when we're acting like a prince of God, then, you know, we are a prince of God. So that's just interesting. And sometimes this happens with us as well. So sometimes you are so rooted in your identity and in who you are and in who God is, and you're acting in such a godly way. And then the next day something happens and you react in a totally fleshly way. And this happens to me, and then I think, oh my word, I just thought you had this down now. So this happens to us as well. And we should really strive to get to a place where we are constantly acting and reacting out of a place of being a prince of God. And then I just want to finish off with facing the enemy, because this really is what this whole study was about, is this enemy that Jacob has been running away from for so many years, this enemy called Esau. And each one of us have this in our lives. It was so interesting for me this week doing this study. I had my own little Esau stand up and just immediately knowing, don't react out of fear, don't react out of your soul, out of your emotions, out of what you're feeling. React out of it is written. So we see in Genesis 32 verse 7, the messengers returned to Jacob saying, we went to your brother Esau and he is coming to meet you. With him are 400 men. That sounds scary. You know, if anyone is coming at you with 400 men, I'm sure most people would think, oops, this is not a welcoming party. And that's certainly how Jacob felt as well. So we see there are 401 men coming at Jacob. There's Esau and the 400 men. And this is something that Grant Luton teaches, and it really helped me even in my struggle this week. Okay, so Aleph, if we look at the Bible, at the Hebrew alphabet, the first letter of the alphabet is Aleph, and that is the numerical value of 1. Okay, so let me just explain to you how Grant gets to this. So in Hebrew, all the Hebrew alphabet letters have numbers. And the moment you see numbers given in the Bible, you can always work the numbers back to the Hebrew letters. So 1 and 400. He asked himself, okay, where do we find the letter 1 or the number 1 and the number 400 in the Hebrew alphabet? And we see that Aleph is number 1 and Tav is number 400. And if you know the Hebrew alphabet, you will know that Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and Tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And who is the Aleph and the Tav? We find this in Revelation, where Yeshua says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. So that's the same. Alpha, Aleph, it's just the Greek alphabet, and Omega, the last letter, Tav. So what is this really saying to us? It's saying that when your enemy comes at you, your enemy is surrounded by the Aleph and the Tav. And nothing happens. Who's got the first say and who's got the last say? It is God. It is the Messiah. So whatever circumstance you face, whatever comes at you, it is surrounded by God. He's allowing it, and he will not allow your enemy to destroy you. We even see the word of God saying, do not fear what they can do to your body, because they can do nothing to your soul, to your spirit. That belongs to God. And I think we go into so much fear about physical things, our physical body, our physical belongings, our physical things. But God's really saying, do not fear, because nothing is coming against you that I'm not allowing. And when your enemy comes, I am surrounding your enemy. I am the one that's coming with Esau. And what happened when Esau came? Esau could do nothing to Jacob. And so actually Jacob was running away for nothing. If he had realized this truth, that God surrounds your enemies, that the covenant surrounds your enemies, the full Torah that's written is written from Aleph to Tav. So it's the entire Torah that's coming through your enemies. And God's even going to use them to change your character. Are you like Esau or are you like Jacob? So that's a question that we need to finish off with today is, are you aligning to the covenant or not? Because if you're not aligning to the covenant, God's going to leave you. He's not going to worry you until you decide to make the journey back to the covenant. If you are like Jacob, don't think it's all going to be wonderful and perfect and just blessings, because with the blessings comes the responsibility of being obedient, of submitting. And God's going to work at you, and it's going to work hard sometimes to change your character, to align with His likeness. What are you wrestling with that you need to surrender to God? Remember, anything you're wrestling with, when you're wrestling, you're holding on to something. Just let it go. What are you holding on to that you do not want to submit to the way God says you should do things? What does your name mean? And are you living up to the full potential of your name, or are you avoiding the potential of your name? And what are you believing about yourself that's not true? So I really hope you enjoyed this Torah portion, and may you have a blessed Shabbat.
Please feel free to leave a comment. If you like this video, click the like button. Remember to subscribe to our channel and don't forget to ring the bell.